Welcome to another Ancestry Sidebar from Circle Ancestry. This is the 5th Sidebar episode. Today we're going to talk about my ancestral village, Závadka. This village has received the most views in my Slovak Ancestry Adventure video series, and it has generated the most input, feedback, and questions. With that, I think people will be interested in seeing the record survey techniques used thus far in the Sidebar series applied to Závadka. Let's start by looking at Závadka geographically, so you're sure which Závadka I'm talking about, since there are at least 4 villages with that name that I know of in modern Slovakia. My Závadka is in the Gelnica district in the Košice region. The nearest large town is Spišská Nová Ves, so you'll see that indicated in some of the graphs I'll show. It was known in Hungarian as Görög falu, or Greek village. Závadka is the most isolated of all my ancestral villages. It's not particularly far away in distance, strictly speaking, but it is relatively high up in the hills compared to its surrounding villages. It's surrounded by dense forest, and there really wasn't any sort of a developed road leading into it until the 1940s. Not that anything considered a developed road before then might have been anything like we think of a developed road being today. Still, due to the difficulty of getting in and out, it's likely nobody just happened to pass through. Recall that Závadka was predominantly a Greek Catholic village, and the people living there were mostly Rusin. Go back to my Slovak Ancestry Adventure, Episode 2, if you want a refresher on just what that means, but for the purpose of this video, it will be interesting to see if this leads to any differences in the record analysis compared to the predominantly Roman Catholic Slovak villages we've looked at in previous sidebars. We also need to realize that the preservation of records varies greatly from village to village in terms of the range of dates when church records exist for baptisms, marriages, deaths, and sometimes even confirmations. In the case of Závadka, the records I've found are limited to baptisms and deaths, and only for a more limited time range than many other villages I've looked at. Here I'll focus on the period of my immigrant ancestors' time in the village. In this case, my great-grandmother, whose maiden name was Anna Hardy, born in 1882. Something else of interest to me is that although Závadka has a Greek Catholic church, the church records at this time are in the Latin language and written in the Roman alphabet. The Rusin language typically uses the Cyrillic alphabet, and I've seen that script used in other later civil records from the village. That the church records are using Latin would not be obvious to me, but I'm not complaining, as I would be useless with Cyrillic writing. I mentioned limited records for the village, and as an example, the available death records for Závadka stop at 1879. They do exist before 1872, but I'll just show this 8-year series to get a flavor. There's an average of 62.4 deaths per year. Notice the spike during 1873. If you think back to our Spišský hrad death records sidebar, 1873 was also a bad year for deaths there due to cholera. That affliction was affecting Závadka as well. In Spišský hrad, there was a spike during August, September, and October. In Závadka, the deaths started to elevate in June and July, but also maxed out in August and remained high in September and October. This graph shows a histogram of death rates per month and illustrates that 5 of the top 6 occurrences were from 1873. The next chart is a histogram of age at death. Quite like Spišský hrad, right around half the deaths occurred at less than age 4. Something we do not see in this chart that was evident in the Spišský hrad chart are the periodic relatively high bars at the ages ending in 0, 40, 50, 60, 70, and so on. Perhaps this scribe was more interested in determining the true age of people, or individuals in Závadka had a better sense for how old their deceased relatives were. Now let's shift to baptism records. This covers 1872 to 1882, the year my great-grandmother was born. During this 11-year snapshot, there's an average of 76.3 baptisms per year. The rate of baptisms versus deaths up to this point indicates that the population decline observed in the 1880 to 1910 village population trends sidebar video has not affected the core growth of the village by 1882. However, in about 1881, the baptism records begin to indicate some fathers as in Americum emigrans in their children's baptism records. Thus, the father is identified, and therefore the baby is legitimate in the eyes of the church. He left for America before the child's birth, but the family hasn't yet followed. This arrangement of husband heading out first on his own is a common story, and it becomes more evident in subsequent years as that indication in Americum emigrans becomes more common in the Závadka baptism records, consistent with the population decline in the village that began around this time. Let's look at the most common names given at baptism for both the girls and the boys. For the girls, Maria is the clear winner, but the race is closer here than it was in the case of our Harihovca baptism name analysis. Anna is a close second place. Katarina is in fourth place here, while that name was second most common in Harihovca. Helena, although a distant third place in Závadka, was much lower on the Harihovca list. The top four names here account for more than 90% of all girls' names. Looking at the boys, Ioannis is the most popular, as it was in Harihovca. It takes the top 6 boys' names to exceed 90%. We do see a couple of names that speak to the Greek tradition, Demetrius and Dionysius. How are those for good Greek names? Well, that's a little to share about Závadka. I hope you enjoyed it. As a hint for what's coming next, I'm going to shift from church record analysis and give an example of analyzing civil records, specifically land books and village maps from the 1850s for Roszkowca, the very small village where my great-grandfather Jan Fefra was sent after the death of his mother to move in with his Novotny uncle and aunt in the 1860s. I'll demonstrate how these resources were used to identify the specific location where my ancestors lived within that village, and relate that information to the modern layout of the village. Please stay tuned for that. Take care and see you next time.